Boy runs with a lifeless baby to the hospital, but what the doctor discovers shocks everyone. The morning light filtered through the windows of Little Treasure's daycare center, casting warm rectangles on the alphabet rug where Marcus Wheeler sat cross-legged, carefully arranging wooden blocks. At 17, he towered over the tiny furniture, his long legs cramped from sitting at child height for the past hour. Still, there was something peaceful about the quiet morning routine. Being the first to arrive, setting up the activities for the day, listening to Ms. Patricia humming old Motown songs in the kitchen as she prepared morning snacks. 6 months ago, if anyone had told him he'd find peace in a daycare center, he would have laughed. But life had a way of surprising you, especially when you least expected it. Marcus? Ms. Patricia's voice carried from the kitchen. Could you check the thermometer by the window? Weather report says we're in for a cold snap today. Yes, ma'am. He unfolded himself from the floor, joints cracking as he stretched to his full height. The old Victorian house that housed Little Treasures had its quirks, and temperature control was definitely one of them. The ancient radiators worked overtime during Boston winters, but they weren't always up to the task. Marcus walked to the window, his reflection ghosting across the glass. A tall, lanky teenager in neat khakis and the blue polo shirt that was part of his volunteer uniform. His mother had ironed it carefully this morning, just like she did every morning, her way of showing support for this new chapter in his life without having to find the words. The digital thermometer read 68 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable enough for now. Outside, gray clouds hung low over Beacon Hill, threatening snow. Early morning commuters hurried past on the sidewalk, bundled in heavy coats and scarves, clutching steaming coffee cups like lifelines. Still holding at 68, he called back to Ms. Patricia. Want me to turn up the radiators? Not yet, honey. Let's see how it goes. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. At 62, Patricia Morrison was a force of nature packed into 5 feet of grandmother-like warmth. Her silver-streaked hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes missed nothing. Those eyes studied him now with their usual mixture of kindness and assessment. You're here early again. Marcus shrugged, turning back to the blocks. Mom's got the early shift at the hospital this week. Figured I might as well come in and get things set up. What he didn't say was that being early meant he could avoid the stares from some of the parents during normal drop-off time. Most had gotten used to his presence over the past 3 months, but there were still a few who clutched their children a little tighter when they saw him, who asked Ms. Patricia in whispers they thought he couldn't hear if she was sure about that boy working with the babies. His mother's words would echo then. The world's gonna see what it wants to see, baby. You just gotta keep proving them wrong. The Collins family is coming in for a tour this morning, Ms. Patricia said casually, too casually. They're looking to enroll their daughter, Emma, 9 months old. Marcus nodded, recognizing this for the warning it was. New parents were always the hardest to win over. Want me to make myself scarce? No. Her voice was firm. You're part of this daycare, Marcus. A valuable part. It's about time people started seeing that. Before he could respond, the front door chimed. Ms. Patricia straightened her apron and headed for the entrance. That'll be them now. Keep doing what you're doing with the blocks. Sometimes the best way to show people who you are is to just let them watch you be yourself. Marcus returned to his careful construction. He was building a castle, the kind that would delight the toddlers when they arrived, full of towers and archways, but sturdy enough to withstand excited little hands. He heard voices in the foyer, the murmur of adult conversation, then the distinct sound of a baby's fussy whimper. And this is our main play area, Ms. Patricia was saying as she led the family into the room. As you can see, we believe in providing an engaging environment with plenty of educational. The whimpering grew louder, threatening to become a full cry. Marcus kept his eyes on his work, adding another tower to his castle, but he couldn't help hearing the mother's worried voice. She's been like this all morning. The pediatrician says it's just separation anxiety, but... The baby's cries grew stronger, echoing off the high ceilings. Without thinking, Marcus began to hum softly. 3 little birds. the same song his mother used to sing to his baby sister. It was automatic, a habit born from years of helping with Jordan before everything changed. The crying hitched, then quieted. He risked a glance up and found himself looking into the biggest brown eyes he'd ever seen. The baby, Emma, was staring at him from her mother's arms, tear tracks still shining on her chubby cheeks, completely transfixed by the sound of his humming. He finished the song softly, then gave her a small smile before returning to his blocks. The silence that followed felt heavy with surprise. "Well," Ms. Patricia said, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice. "It seems like Emma's already making friends." Later, after the Collins family had left, with Emma waving her tiny hand at Marcus as they went, Ms. Patricia found him organizing the book corner. "They're enrolling her," she said, "starting next week." She paused, then added, "I told them about your background, Marcus. About the youth program, about how you came to us. I hope that was okay." He looked up, surprised. Usually, she left that conversation for him to handle if and when he chose to. "What did they say?" "They said anyone who could calm their daughter that quickly was someone they wanted to know more about." She smiled. "Sometimes, child, the best way to change people's minds is to just be exactly who you are." Marcus nodded, feeling something tight in his chest begin to loosen. Outside, the first snowflakes of the day began to fall, dusting the windowsills with white. The radiator clanked and groaned, fighting against the dropping temperature. But inside Little Treasures, Marcus felt warm. He didn't know it then, but that morning marked the beginning of something none of them could have predicted. In the weeks to come, Emma Collins would become more than just another baby in his care. She would become the catalyst for a chain of events that would test everything he believed about himself, about second chances, and about what it means to be truly brave. But for now, he simply returned to his work, humming softly as the snow fell outside, content in the knowledge that for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he needed to be. The weeks following Emma Collins' arrival at Little Treasures brought changes that nobody, least of all Marcus, could have anticipated. December had settled over Boston like a heavy blanket, transforming the city into a landscape of white frosted brownstones and steam-clouded windows. Inside the daycare, life fell into a rhythm as predictable as the winter snow. Every morning at 8:15, Sarah Collins would arrive with Emma bundled against the cold. The first few days, Sarah's smile had been tentative when she saw Marcus, her grip on Emma's carrier just a little too tight. But Emma's reaction to him was impossible to ignore. The moment she heard his voice, her whole face would light up, tiny hands reaching out with unwavering certainty. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah confided to Ms. Patricia one morning, when she thought Marcus couldn't hear. "She won't even go to my sister like that, and Lisa's been around since she was born." Marcus tried not to let it matter too much, this gradual warming in Sarah's eyes. He focused instead on doing his job, on proving through actions what words could never quite convey. He learned Emma's schedule by heart, her preference for the blue pacifier over the pink one, how she liked to be held with her head tucked under his chin when she was tired, the specific bounce and sway rhythm that could soothe her teething pain. One morning, as he was singing Emma to sleep for her nap, he caught Miss Patricia watching him with an odd expression. "What?" he whispered, carefully laying Emma in her crib. "Nothing." She smiled, shaking her head. "Just thinking about the day you first walked in here with Mr. Rodriguez. Remember what you said when I asked why you wanted to work with children?" Marcus did remember. He'd been looking at his shoes, shoulders hunched against the weight of his past, said I wanted to be around something good for a change. "And now look at you." She gestured to Emma, peacefully sleeping. "Sometimes the good finds us when we least expect it." The memory of his sister Jordan tried to surface then, but he pushed it away. Some wounds were still too fresh to examine, even after all this time. As December progressed, Marcus settled deeper into his role at Little Treasures. The other parents began to relax around him, some even seeking him out during pickup time to ask about their children's day. He started taking classes 2 evenings a week at the community college, early childhood development courses that Mr. Rodriguez had helped him enroll in. "You've got a gift," Mr. Rodriguez had said during their monthly check-in. "Might as well make it official." Even Thomas Collins, Emma's father, had begun to thaw. A corporate lawyer with an perpetually worried expression, he'd been the more openly skeptical of Emma's parents at first. But one evening, arriving early for pickup, he'd stood in the doorway watching Marcus read "Goodnight Moon" to Emma and 2 other infants, all of them completely captivated by his dramatic whispers and gentle gestures. "You're good with them," Thomas had said afterward, something like surprised respect in his voice. "Really good." "Thank you, sir," Marcus had replied, careful to maintain the professional distance Ms. Patricia had taught him. Never too familiar, never too casual, always aware of the line between caregiver and parent. But then came the morning that changed everything. It started with the snow. Heavy, wet flakes that had been falling since dawn. The old radiators in Little Treasures were working overtime, filling the rooms with their familiar clanking and hissing. Marcus arrived early as usual, stomping snow from his boots in the entryway. "Thermometer's reading a little low," Miss Patricia called from the kitchen. "Would you check the basement? Make sure the boiler's keeping up?" The basement of Little Treasures was a maze of storage rooms and ancient utilities. Marcus made his way down the creaking stairs, flashlight in hand. The boiler, a hulking metal beast that had probably been installed during the Roosevelt administration, was making an unusual rattling sound. "Ms. Patricia?" he called up the stairs. "I think we might have a problem down here." She appeared at the top of the stairs, frowning. "What kind of problem?" "Not sure, but it doesn't sound right. Maybe we should call—" The sound of the front door chime interrupted him. Parents arriving early, driven by the worsening weather. Ms. Patricia hurried to greet them, calling back, "Keep an eye on it. I'll phone the repair service as soon as I get everyone settled." Over the next hour, children arrived in a steady stream as parents rushed to beat the deteriorating conditions. The temperature in the daycare held steady, though the radiator's clanking grew more pronounced. Marcus kept busy with the morning routine, helping with coats and boots, organizing activities, keeping the older children entertained while the babies napped. Emma arrived with Sarah at her usual time, dressed in a tiny pink snowsuit that made her look like a marshmallow. She squealed with delight when she saw Marcus, nearly launching herself out of her mother's arms. "She was asking for Mar all morning," Sarah said with a laugh, handing her over. "At least I think that's what she was trying to say." Marcus felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the building's heating system. Emma's first attempts at his name had started a few days ago, and each time she did it, it felt like a tiny miracle. Sarah lingered longer than usual, reluctant to head out into the storm. "The weather's supposed to get worse. They're talking about early closures downtown. Should I?" "We'll be fine," Miss Patricia assured her. "We've got emergency procedures in place if things get bad, and Marcus is staying late today to help out." Sarah nodded, kissed Emma goodbye, and headed out into the swirling snow. Through the windows they could see the storm intensifying, the world beyond the glass becoming increasingly white and formless. It was during morning snack time that the first real sign of trouble appeared. The radiator's clanking had turned into an ominous wheeze, and Marcus noticed Emma shivering slightly in her playpen. "Miss Patricia?" He tried to keep his voice casual to avoid alarming the children. "Think we might need to check that temperature again." She was already moving toward the thermometer, her face tightening as she read the display. 64 degrees and dropping. She pulled out her phone, presumably to call the repair service, then frowned at the screen. No signal. The storm must be affecting the towers. Marcus looked around the room. They had 15 children today, including 4 infants. The older ones were already asking to keep their coats on, and Emma's lips were starting to look slightly blue. "Something's wrong," he said, lifting her quickly from the playpen. Her skin felt cool to the touch, much cooler than it should be. "Ms. Patricia, something's really wrong. She's not just cold, she's..." Emma's eyes fluttered, her usually animated face becoming unnaturally still. And that's when Marcus Wheeler realized he was about to make a decision that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone at Little Treasures Daycare. A decision that would either damn him or save him. But in that moment, looking into Emma's increasingly vacant eyes, he knew there was really no decision at all. "I'm taking her to the hospital," he said, already moving toward the coat rack. "Mass General's 6 blocks away. I can run it." "Marcus, wait," Ms. Patricia started, but he was already wrapping Emma in her blanket, his mind racing ahead to the fastest route through the snow-choked streets. "Call an ambulance if you can get a signal," he called back. "Call her parents." "But I'm not waiting. Something's really wrong with her, and I'm not going to stand here and watch it happen." The last thing he heard as he burst out into the storm was Miss Patricia's voice, tight with worry. "Be careful. Both of you. Please. Be careful." The snow hit his face like tiny needles as he began to run, holding Emma close to his chest. He didn't know then that his actions in the next 20 minutes would spark a chain of events that would test not just his character, but the assumptions and prejudices of an entire community. All he knew was that the small bundle in his arms was getting more still by the second, and that whatever consequences awaited him at the end of this run, they couldn't possibly be worse than doing nothing at all. The wind howled around him as he ran, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll the hour, their sound muffled by the falling snow. The emergency room at Massachusetts General pulsed with the controlled chaos typical of winter storm days. Through the sliding glass doors, bursts of Arctic air accompanied each new arrival, carrying swirls of snow and the sharp scent of approaching night. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across faces drawn tight with worry, while the squeak of medical shoes against linoleum provided a steady backbeat to the murmured conversations and occasional cry of pain. Sarah Collins burst through these doors at 10:47 a.m., snow melting from her carefully styled hair, her camel hair coat askew and dotted with dark spots of moisture. The scene that greeted her made her blood run cold. 2 police officers stationed by the entrance, their faces professionally blank. Security guards positioned at every corridor junction, speaking quietly into radio units. And a cluster of hospital administrators near the intake desk, their hushed conversation cutting off abruptly as they noticed her arrival. "My daughter," she gasped, manicured fingers gripping the counter so hard her knuckles went white. "Emma Collins. I was told." Her voice caught, the words sticking in her throat like shards of ice. The morning replayed in her mind. Emma's unusual fussiness at breakfast, the way she'd clung to Sarah longer than usual at drop-off, as if she'd known something was coming. "Mrs. Collins?" A serious-faced man in an expensive suit stepped forward from the group of administrators. "I'm Howard Matthews, Hospital Chief of Security. Please, come with me." "Where's my baby?" The hysteria in her voice drew glances from the waiting room. "They said on the phone, your daughter is receiving care," Matthews interrupted smoothly, his hand hovering near her elbow without quite touching it. "But there are some circumstances we need to discuss." Sarah followed him through the labyrinth of hospital corridors, her heels clicking against the linoleum in an uneven rhythm that matched her racing heart. Through the windows lining one wall, she could see the snow falling harder now, transforming Boston into a white blur. The city was disappearing, much like her sense of normalcy had disappeared with that phone call 40 minutes ago. "Mrs. Collins, there's been an incident at Little Treasures." Matthews led her to a small conference room tucked away from the main traffic areas. A detective was waiting inside, his weathered face bearing the careful neutrality that comes from years of delivering bad news. Beside him sat a woman in a charcoal business suit who introduced herself as Rebecca Torres from Child Protective Services. Sarah's world tilted sideways. The room seemed to spin, and she grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "Child Protective? What's going on?" "Please, sit down, Mrs. Collins," Detective Morrison said, gesturing to the chair she was gripping. His voice had that particular gentleness that police officers reserve for victims' families. "What can you tell us about Marcus Wheeler?" "Marcus?" The question seemed to come from very far away. He's one of Emma's caregivers at Little Treasures. What does this have to do with... Are you aware of his criminal record?" The words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah sank into the chair, her legs no longer able to support her. "Criminal?" Last year, Mr. Wheeler was involved in an incident resulting in the death of a minor. The room seemed to contract around her. Sarah's mind raced back through every interaction with Marcus, his gentle way with Emma, the songs he would sing, the way her daughter's face would light up at the sight of him. How could someone who brought such joy to her baby have such darkness in his past? Death of... number. There must be some mistake. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. "Marcus wouldn't... He's so good with Emma. She loves him." Ms. Torres leaned forward, her expression carefully composed. "Mrs. Collins, we have reason to believe that Mr. Wheeler may have deliberately exposed your daughter to dangerous conditions today." "What? No, that's ridiculous." Sarah shook her head violently, sending droplets of melted snow flying from her hair. "The heating failed. He brought her to... The heating system at Little Treasures was functioning normally in every room except the infant care area." Detective Morrison cut in, consulting a small notebook. "We have witnesses who say Mr. Wheeler was seen in the basement near the control panel this morning before the temperature drop occurred." Sarah's mind raced back through the morning. Emma's unusual fussiness, Marcus's quick offer to take her, his insistence on being the one to handle her feedings today. Details that had seemed innocent just hours ago now took on a more sinister cast. She felt sick. But why would he? "We believe he may have been attempting to recreate the circumstances that led to the death of his sister last year." The door burst open before Sarah could process this revelation. Thomas Collins stood in the doorway, his usual lawyer's composure cracking around the edges. Snow dusted his dark suit, and his tie was askew, small details that spoke volumes about his state of mind. Thomas never looked anything less than perfectly put together. "Where's Emma?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority that had won him countless courtroom victories. "What's happening?" Before anyone could respond, a new figure appeared behind Thomas, a petite Asian woman in a white coat, her face bearing the focused intensity of someone who had been dealing with emergencies all day. "Mr. and Mrs. Collins?" Dr. Chen's expression was carefully neutral. "There's something you need to see." They followed Dr. Chen through the maze of corridors, each step echoing with unasked questions. The hospital seemed different now, more threatening, as if its very walls held secrets waiting to be revealed. Thomas's hand found Sarah's, squeezing tightly. The gesture reminded her of another hospital corridor, 3 years ago, when they'd rushed to the same building thinking they'd lost Emma before she was even born. False labor, it had turned out. But the fear, that bone-deep terror of losing their child, felt exactly the same. Through the observation window of a small treatment room, they could see Emma looking impossibly tiny under warming blankets, surrounded by monitoring equipment that beeped in steady, reassuring rhythms. But it was the second figure in the room that made Sarah gasp. An elderly woman in navy scrubs sat beside Emma's bed, her silver hair pulled back in a familiar bun. Ms. Patricia looked up as they entered, and Sarah was struck by how old she suddenly appeared. The usual warmth and energy that characterized the daycare director had been replaced by something heavier, more burdened. "Before you say anything," Ms. Patricia began, raising a hand to forestall the flood of questions she must have seen in their faces. "There's something you need to know about Marcus, about Jordan, about everything." She pulled a worn photograph from her pocket and handed it to Sarah. The image showed a younger Marcus, maybe 15, holding a little girl with his same wide smile. They were sitting on a park swing, autumn leaves swirling around them, both laughing at something beyond the camera's view. "That's Jordan Wheeler," Ms. Patricia said softly. Marcus's sister. She was 3 when this was taken. 3 months later, she was gone. The story that followed emerged in pieces, like a puzzle being assembled in reverse. Jordan Wheeler had been Marcus's 3-year-old sister, a bright, beautiful child with an undiagnosed heart condition that had been missed in routine checkups. On a winter day much like this one, during a game of hide-and-seek, she had collapsed suddenly. Marcus, only 16 and home alone with her while their mother worked a double shift at the hospital cafeteria, had tried desperately to save her. He ran 12 blocks through the snow to Boston Children's, Ms. Patricia continued, her voice thick with emotion. Carried her the whole way, singing to her, trying to keep her warm. By the time he got there, she trailed off, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The guilt nearly destroyed him. A new voice added from the doorway. Mr. Rodriguez, Marcus's youth counselor, stood there, his dark eyes heavy with remembered pain. That's why he started acting out, getting into trouble. He blamed himself for not recognizing the signs sooner, for not knowing what to do. The incident in his record? He broke into a medical training facility at night, was trying to teach himself emergency pediatric care. But the heating system, Detective Morrison interjected, though his voice held less certainty now. The witnesses. Check your witnesses again, Mr. Rodriguez replied, holding up his phone. Because I have security footage from Little Treasures showing exactly what happened in that basement this morning. Marcus wasn't sabotaging anything. He was desperately trying to fix the heating when he realized it was failing. And I have the repair company's preliminary report right here. He handed his phone to the detective. The time-stamped footage showed Marcus in the basement, frantically working with tools, making repeated calls on his phone that clearly weren't going through. The timestamp matched the period when the storm had knocked out cell service across the area. Dr. Chen stepped forward then, her tablet displaying a series of test results. The medical terminology was complex, but the implications were clear. Emma had a rare condition called pediatric reflex cold bradycardia, causing her heart rate to drop dramatically in response to cold temperatures. Her symptoms today, Doctor, Chen explained, pulling up another file, were nearly identical to those documented in Jordan Wheeler's final crisis. The implications hit everyone like a physical wave. Marcus hadn't been recreating a tragedy. He'd been preventing one. He'd recognized the signs because he'd seen them before, in the worst moment of his life. But there was more. A nurse appeared with another set of medical records, Jordan Wheeler's final autopsy report, updated 6 months ago with new genetic information. She had carried a marker for the same condition that had affected Emma today. Don't you see? Dr. Chen said softly, looking from Sarah to Thomas. If Marcus hadn't recognized those symptoms, if he hadn't acted exactly as he did, history would have repeated itself in the worst possible way. Sarah sank into a chair beside Emma's bed, her hand finding her daughter's. The little girl's skin was warm now, her color good. All the monitors showed strong, steady rhythms. She tried to imagine how different this scene might be if Marcus hadn't known what to look for, hadn't understood the urgency of those first warning signs. Where is he now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In custody, Detective Morrison admitted reluctantly. Downtown. Thomas straightened, and Sarah recognized the shift in his posture. This was Thomas the lawyer now, the man who had never lost a case when he believed in his client's innocence. On what charges? Technically, none. It was protective custody given his history, but get him released, now. Thomas's voice was pure steel. And then get me every piece of paper documenting this department's actions today. Every single one. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was watching Emma, who had begun to stir. Her daughter's eyes fluttered open, and her first unclear word was unmistakable. Mar? The room fell silent. In that moment, the full weight of what had nearly happened, not just to Emma, but to Marcus, hit them all. They had almost destroyed a young man's second chance at redemption because of assumptions, because of fear, because of a past that had been misunderstood in the worst possible way. Ms. Patricia stood slowly, her joints creaking slightly. "There's something else you should know. The reason Marcus was so insistent on working with the infants, on taking all those early childhood development classes." She pulled out her phone and showed them another photo. It was Marcus sitting on the alphabet rug at Little Treasures, surrounded by medical textbooks. He's been studying cardiac care in infants. 3 nights a week after his shift ends, he takes classes at the community college. He wants to become a pediatric cardiac nurse because of Jordan. Sarah looked at Thomas, tears streaming down her face. "We have to fix this." Thomas nodded, already pulling out his phone, no doubt mentally composing the legal strategy that would clear Marcus's name. But fixing it would prove more complicated than any of them imagined. Howard Matthews reappeared in the doorway, his face grave. "We have a problem," he said, holding up his tablet. On the screen, a local news website's headline screamed, "Troubled teen endangers infant at elite daycare." Below it, Marcus's yearbook photo was juxtaposed with an image of Little Treasure's facade, police cars visible in the frame. "It's already gone viral," Matthews continued. "The press is outside. They're calling it a near tragedy stopped by alert staff. They're painting him as a monster," Sarah finished, her voice breaking. "We helped paint him as a monster." Through the window, she could see the snow was falling harder now, transforming the hospital parking lot into a blank canvas. Somewhere out there, Marcus Wheeler sat in a cell, probably thinking he'd lost everything: his job, his future, his chance at redemption. All because he'd had the courage to remember his worst day, to recognize its patterns in time to prevent another family from experiencing the same loss. Emma stirred again, reaching out with one tiny hand. Sarah caught it, feeling the strong, steady pulse in her daughter's wrist. Thanks to Marcus, that pulse would continue to beat. Thanks to Marcus, she wouldn't have to know what it felt like to lose a child to the cold. "Thomas," she said, turning to her husband, "whatever it takes, whatever it costs, we make this right." He nodded, already dialing his phone. "First step, we get him out. Then we call every media contact I have. We tell the real story." Dr. Chen cleared her throat. "The hospital will support this. The medical records clearly show—" "No," Sarah interrupted. "Not just the medical facts, the whole story. About Jordan. About what he's been studying. About everything. The world needs to know who Marcus Wheeler really is." Ms. Patricia smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "He won't like that. He's never wanted attention for any of it, especially not about Jordan." "Sometimes," Thomas said quietly, "the stories we least want told are the ones that most need telling." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in white, while inside the hospital, a small group of people began the difficult work of untangling truth from assumption, redemption from revenge, and the complex ways in which the past shapes but does not define us. Emma slept peacefully now, her vital signs strong and steady. Above her bed, the monitors beeped a quiet rhythm, like a metronome counting out the moments until justice could find its way through the storm. And somewhere across the city, in a holding cell at Boston Police Department, Marcus Wheeler sat alone, unaware that his act of desperate courage had not only saved a life, but had set in motion a chain of events that would force an entire community to confront its deepest prejudices. The story of 2 children, one lost, one saved, was about to become something larger, a testament to the power of second chances, and a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is remember our deepest wounds, not to dwell in them, but to ensure they never wound another. Snow was still falling 2 days later when Marcus Wheeler walked out of the Boston Police Department, blinking in the harsh morning light. Mr. Rodriguez stood waiting beside his salt-stained Civic, a garment bag draped over one arm. "Thought you might want to change before the press conference," he said, holding out the bag. Marcus stared at it uncomprehendingly. "Press conference?" "Thomas Collins has arranged everything. He's got all the major networks. Mr. Rodriguez studied his young charge's face. You don't have to do this, you know. He's already handled the legal side. The charges are dropped, your record is sealed. Marcus took the garment bag slowly. Inside was a new charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, navy tie. The kind of outfit that said, "Trust me, believe me, hear me." How's Emma? Going home today. The doctors say she'll need regular monitoring, but she'll be fine. Mr. Rodriguez paused. Her parents want you there. For the discharge. Marcus shook his head. I can't. After everything, you're the reason she's going home at all. The drive to Massachusetts General took longer than usual, the streets still clogged with plowed snow. Marcus watched the city crawl past, remembering another snowy day, another desperate drive to a hospital. But this time the ending was different. The hospital's main entrance was crowded with news vans and reporters stamping their feet against the cold. Mr. Rodriguez drove around to a side entrance where Thomas Collins waited, looking every inch the successful attorney in his perfectly tailored suit. Marcus? He extended his hand. We have about 20 minutes before the press conference. There's someone who wants to see you first. The pediatric ward was quieter than Marcus remembered. They stopped outside room 412, and Thomas gestured for him to go in alone. Sarah Collins sat in the rocking chair by the window, Emma cradled in her arms. Both looked up as Marcus entered, and Emma's face split into her familiar broad smile. Mar. She reached for him with both hands. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway until Sarah stood and crossed to him, gently transferring Emma to his arms. The baby immediately snuggled into his shoulder, her favorite position. We've been talking about Jordan, Sarah said softly. Marcus stiffened, but Sarah continued. About how proud she would be of her big brother. About how her story helped save Emma's life. I should have saved her too. The words came out before he could stop them. No. Sarah's voice was firm. You did everything you could for Jordan. And because of that experience, because you remembered every detail, you knew exactly what to do for Emma. Jordan is still saving lives, through you. Emma patted Marcus's cheek with one tiny hand, and he felt tears starting to form. Sarah pretended not to notice, continuing in a conversational tone. We've been thinking, she said, about starting a foundation. The Jordan Wheeler Foundation for Pediatric Cardiac Care. Full scholarships for promising nursing students, funding for research into early detection of conditions like PRCB. She paused. We'd like you to be on the board. Marcus looked up sharply. Me? Who better? You're already studying pediatric nursing, aren't you? All those books at the daycare. How did you... Ms. Patricia told us everything about your classes, your goals. Sarah smiled. The foundation's first scholarship is yours if you want it. Full ride, any nursing program in the country. Before Marcus could respond, Thomas appeared in the doorway. It's time. The press conference was set up in the hospital's main conference room. Marcus sat between Thomas and Dr. Chen as cameras flashed and reporters called out questions. He listened as the doctor explained PRCB, as Thomas outlined the legal facts, as Mr. Rodriguez spoke about redemption and second chances. Then it was his turn. Marcus stood slowly, adjusting the tie that suddenly felt too tight. The room fell silent. 3 years ago, he began, I lost my sister Jordan. His voice cracked, but he pushed on. He told them everything. About the game of hide and seek, about running through the snow, about the guilt and the pain and the desperate need to make sure it never happened to another family. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Later that evening, back in his own bedroom, Marcus opened his laptop to find his story had gone viral, but not the way the police had initially spun it. This version, the true version, was being shared with hashtags like #2 second chances and #2 the Jordan legacy. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. It was a photo of Emma, home now, wearing a onesie that read, My hero wears scrubs, in training. Below it was a simple message. See you Monday? Marcus smiled, thinking of the daycare, of Ms. Patricia's proud smile, of tiny hands reaching for him and squealing, "Mar Mar." See you Monday, he typed back. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling. In its place, a brilliant sunset painted the city in shades of hope, turning every icy surface into something golden and new. Somewhere, Marcus liked to think, Jordan was smiling. Spring came early to Boston that year. March winds swept away the last traces of winter, and Little Treasure's daycare bloomed with new life, literally, as Ms. Patricia's window boxes erupted with pansies and early tulips. Marcus Wheeler adjusted his graduation cap in the hallway mirror, the blue tassel swaying with each movement. His white medical scrubs beneath the gown marked him as part of the first graduating class of the Jordan Wheeler Foundation's accelerated nursing program. Still crooked, his mother said, reaching up to straighten the cap. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Your sister would be so proud. Before Marcus could respond, a familiar squeal echoed down the hallway. 3-year-old Emma Collins came barreling toward him, her dark curls bouncing. Nurse Marmar, up, she demanded, arms raised. Marcus scooped her up, careful not to wrinkle his graduation gown. What do you think, Miss Emma? Do I look ready? She studied him seriously, then reached for his stethoscope, his graduation gift from the Collins family, inscribed with both Emma's and Jordan's names. You need to listen to my heart, she informed him solemnly, like always. This had become their ritual during his clinical rotations at the pediatric cardiac unit. Every time he volunteered there, Emma would insist on being his first patient. Sarah Collins appeared in the doorway, smiling at the scene. Sorry, Marcus. She wouldn't let us go to the ceremony without stopping here first. I wouldn't have it any other way, he replied, and meant it. Little Treasures had become more than just the place where he'd found his redemption. It was where he'd discovered his calling, where he'd learned that sometimes the deepest wounds could become the greatest gifts, if you were brave enough to learn from them. The daycare itself had transformed too. The Jordan Wheeler Foundation had funded a complete renovation, including state-of-the-art medical monitoring systems and emergency equipment. What had happened with Emma would never happen again. Ms. Patricia appeared from her office, carrying a small gift-wrapped package. Almost time for the ceremony, but this couldn't wait. Inside the package was a framed photograph. Marcus recognized it immediately, him and Jordan on the swings, laughing. But now it was paired with a new photo, him and Emma in almost the same pose taken just last week at the park. Below the photos was an inscription. Some angels watch from above, others walk beside us, showing us the way. For your new office, Ms. Patricia explained, the pediatric unit should know who inspired their newest nurse. Marcus traced the edge of the frame, remembering. The weight of Jordan in his arms that day, so still. The weight of Emma, just as still, but with a different ending. 2 moments that had shaped his entire life. Thank you, he managed, his voice thick. The graduation ceremony would be packed. The Collins family, his mother, Mr. Rodriguez, the entire staff of Little Treasures, even some of his former charges and their parents. The foundation's success had made headlines, and several news crews would be there to cover its first graduating class. But right now, in this quiet moment, Marcus Wheeler stood in the place where everything had changed, holding a little girl who had helped him save himself, surrounded by people who had seen past his darkest day to who he could become. Emma patted his cheek, bringing him back to the present. Time to make other kids better, she said with 3-year-old wisdom. That's right, sweet girl. He hugged her close one last time before setting her down. That's exactly right. As they all headed out to the ceremony, Marcus paused in the doorway of Little Treasures. The alphabet rug where he'd first held Emma was still there, worn but bright. The window where he'd first noticed the dropping temperature still looked out on the street where he'd made his desperate run. But now, when he remembered running through the snow, he thought not of failure but of triumph, not of loss but of second chances. not of endings but of beginnings. "Ready?" Ms. Patricia asked softly. Marcus nodded, touching the stethoscope around his neck like a talisman. "Jordan showed me the way," he said. "Now it's my turn to help show others." They stepped out into the spring sunshine, leaving behind the shadows of winter, but carrying forward its most precious lessons. That love can bridge any distance, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the heaviest weight we carry becomes the foundation on which we build our strongest selves. Behind them, the doors of Little Treasures closed softly, like a book reaching its final page. But for Marcus Wheeler, for Emma Collins, and for all the lives they would touch, this was just the beginning. "Race you to the car, Nurse Marmar," Emma called, already running. Marcus laughed and followed, his graduation gown billowing behind him like wings.
Girl finds unconscious baby in park and takes her immediately to hospital. When the doctor examines the baby, she cries desperately at what she discovers. The late September breeze rustled through Riverside Park, scattering amber leaves across the worn footpath where 11-year-old Sophie Bennett walked alone. Her Saturday afternoon routine usually involved volunteering at the Millbrook Animal Shelter, but today they were closed for renovations. She kicked at the fallen leaves, her purple sneakers scuffed from countless similar walks, and adjusted the matching butterfly clips in her dark brown hair. Sophie loved this particular stretch of the park, where ancient oaks created a natural tunnel overhead and squirrels darted between the weathered wooden benches. The area was quieter than usual today. The approaching storm had driven most visitors home early. Dark clouds loomed above the tree canopy, and the wind carried the sharp scent of impending rain. "Just one more lap," she whispered to herself, mimicking her mother's voice. "Then straight home before the storm hits." That's when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost convinced herself it was just the wind. But Sophie had spent enough time at the animal shelter to recognize distress, even in its quietest form. She stopped, holding her breath, and listened. There it was again. A weak whimper coming from behind the large rhododendron bush near the park's eastern fence. "Hello," Sophie called out, taking cautious steps toward the sound. "Is someone there?" The bush's thick leaves trembled in the strengthening wind, and Sophie noticed a small gap between its branches and the fence. Crouching down, she peered into the shadows. Her heart nearly stopped. A baby lay there, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket that had gone dirty gray around the edges. The infant's face was alarmingly still, lips tinged with a subtle blue that Sophie knew wasn't right. She'd seen enough medical shows with her mother, a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, to recognize when something was terribly wrong. "Oh no," Sophie muttered, her hands shaking as she reached for the baby. The blanket was damp from the morning dew, and the infant felt cool to her touch. With great care, she lifted the baby, cradling it close to her chest just as she'd been taught to hold her cousin's newborn last Christmas. Sophie's mind raced. St. Mary's Hospital was only 2 blocks away. She could see its red brick tower rising above the trees. Should she call 911? No, that would take too long. The baby felt so light in her arms, so fragile. Each second seemed precious. "It's okay," she whispered to the infant, though her voice quavered. "I'm going to get you help. Just hold on." She ran. The journey to St. Mary's emergency department entrance felt like the longest 2 blocks of Sophie's life. Each footfall jarred through her body, and she tried to minimize the impact on the precious bundle in her arms. The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing a blast of warm air scented with antiseptic. "Help!" Sophie called out, her voice cracking. "Please, I found a baby. The baby needs help." The emergency room erupted into action. A nurse in blue scrubs rushed forward, already calling for assistance. Sophie found herself surrounded by medical staff, their voices overlapping in urgent but controlled tones. Where did you find the infant? How long has the baby been unresponsive? What's your name, sweetheart? Sophie answered their questions as best she could, her words tumbling out in a rush. Through the chaos, she noticed a woman in a white coat hurrying toward them. Dr. Sarah Chen's name badge caught the fluorescent light as she approached, her dark eyes quickly assessing the situation. "I'll take it from here," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that somehow calmed the chaos around them. She reached for the baby with practiced hands, and Sophie felt an inexplicable reluctance to let go. "You did the right thing bringing the baby here," the doctor added softly, noting Sophie's hesitation. "You may have saved this little one's life." As the medical team whisked the baby away through heavy double doors, Sophie stood rooted to the spot, her empty arms still curved as if holding the infant. A security guard approached, asking if she needed to call her parents. Sophie nodded numbly, suddenly aware of how her heart was pounding. While waiting for her mother to arrive, Sophie couldn't shake the image of Dr. Chen's face in that first moment she'd seen the baby. There had been something in the doctor's expression, a flicker of recognition or pain, that seemed deeper than professional concern. Sophie had always been good at reading people. It was what made her so effective with the scared animals at the shelter. And something told her that Dr. Chen's story was somehow entangled with the baby's fate in ways she couldn't yet understand. Through the emergency room windows, Sophie watched as the threatened storm finally broke, rain streaming down the glass in silver rivulets. She pressed her hand against the cool surface, remembering the weight of the baby in her arms, and whispered a quiet prayer to whoever might be listening. Her mother would arrive soon, and the police would want to ask questions. But for now, Sophie remained by the window, her thoughts with the tiny life she discovered and the haunted look in Dr. Chen's eyes. Something told her this was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would change not only her life but the lives of everyone involved in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere beyond the double doors, Dr. Chen was fighting to save a life while confronting ghosts of her own. Sophie settled into one of the hard plastic chairs, prepared to wait for as long as necessary. After all, she thought, you couldn't just walk away after finding something so precious, so fragile, so in need of protection. Thunder rolled in the distance, and Sophie closed her eyes, sending up another silent prayer for the baby, for Dr. Chen, and for whoever had felt desperate enough to leave their child alone in the park on this stormy Saturday afternoon. Dr. Sarah Chen stood motionless in the hospital's dimly lit diagnostic viewing room, staring at the brain MRI images illuminated on the screen before her. Her hands, which had remained steady throughout the baby's initial examination and subsequent tests, now trembled slightly as she reached out to trace the telltale lesions on the scan. The symmetrical patterns of light and shadow told a story she knew all too well, one that had haunted her dreams for the past year. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible even in the empty room. "Not again." The bilateral lesions in the basal ganglia were hauntingly familiar. She had spent countless nights studying similar images of her daughter Emma's scans just a year ago. The baby from the park, a little girl approximately 4 months old, showed the characteristic patterns of Lee syndrome, the same rare mitochondrial disease that had taken Emma from her. Sarah's mind drifted back to those endless nights spent in this very room, desperately searching for alternative explanations, for some sign she might have missed, for any hope at all. She clicked through the series of images, each one confirming her fears. The elevated lactate levels from the preliminary blood work, the subtle but distinctive brain stem abnormalities. It was like watching a replay of her worst nightmare. Sarah pulled up Emma's old scans on her secure medical tablet, placing them side by side with the new ones. The similarities were undeniable. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Dr. Chen?" It was Nancy Ramirez, one of the senior PICU nurses who had been there throughout Emma's illness. Nancy had held Sarah when she finally broke down after Emma's passing, and now her presence carried both comfort and concern. "The police are here, and that young girl who brought the baby in her mother's arrived too. They're waiting in the family consultation room." Sarah took a deep breath, straightening her white coat. "Thank you, Nancy. Has social services been notified?" "They're sending someone, but it'll be at least an hour." Storms causing traffic delays. Nancy hesitated, then added softly, "Sarah, I saw the preliminary results. Are you sure you should be handling this case?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah smoothed her coat again, a nervous habit she'd developed during her residency. "I have to, Nancy. I'm the most qualified pediatric neurologist on call, and..." She glanced back at the scans. "And maybe this time I can make a difference." Nancy's expression softened with understanding. She'd been there for every step of Emma's journey, had witnessed Sarah's transformation from confident physician to desperate mother, and finally to a woman trying to rebuild herself from the ashes of loss. "Just remember you're not alone this time either," Nancy said, squeezing Sarah's arm gently before leaving. The walk to the consultation room felt longer than usual. Sarah's mind raced between professional obligation and personal anguish, her thoughts interrupted by fragments of memory, Emma's laugh, the way her dark curls would bounce when she was excited, the final peaceful expression on her face when she slipped away. The baby's condition was critical but stable for now. She had responded well to the initial treatments for her metabolic crisis, but Sarah knew all too well the challenging road ahead. She paused outside the consultation room door, gathering her composure. Through the narrow window, she could see Sophie Bennett perched on the edge of a chair, her legs swinging slightly, a reminder of just how young she was despite her remarkably mature actions today. Beside her sat a woman who shared her dark hair and gentle features, presumably her mother. Two police officers stood near the window, their reflections ghosting against the rain-streaked glass. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. The weight of her stethoscope around her neck, the familiar scratch of her coat's fabric, the distant beeping of monitors, these small sensations helped ground her in her professional role. She could do this. She had to do this. "I'm Dr. Chen," she introduced herself as she entered, managing to keep her voice steady. "I've been treating the infant Sophie brought in." Detective Marcus Rivera stepped forward, notebook in hand. She recognized him from the pediatric unit's annual safety training sessions. He specialized in cases involving children. "Doctor, what can you tell us about the baby's condition?" Sarah glanced at Sophie, noting the girl's wide-eyed concern. She chose her words carefully, conscious of her young audience. "The baby is stable but critical. She's approximately 4 months old and shows signs of a serious underlying medical condition. We're still running tests to confirm the exact diagnosis." The lie of omission felt heavy. She was already certain about the Lee syndrome diagnosis, but announcing it here felt premature without absolute confirmation. More importantly, she knew from bitter experience how devastating that diagnosis could be. Whoever this baby's mother was, she deserved to hear it in a more private setting. "Any signs of abuse?" Detective Rivera's partner, Officer Thompson, asked. She was newer to the force, and her question carried an edge of suspicion that made Sarah bristle internally. "No visible trauma or signs of neglect, apart from being left in the park," Sarah replied, her tone professional but firm. "The baby is well-nourished and was clean before being exposed to the elements. Her weight is appropriate for her age, and there are no signs of chronic neglect." "This?" Sarah paused, choosing her next words carefully. "This feels like an act of desperation rather than malice." Sophie suddenly spoke up, her voice small but clear. "Will she be okay?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. How many times had she asked herself that same question about Emma? How many times had she promised her daughter everything would be fine, even as hope slipped away? She looked at Sophie's earnest face and saw the same desperate need for reassurance she'd once seen in her own reflection. "We're doing everything we can," Sarah replied, the standard medical response falling from her lips automatically. But something in Sophie's expression made her add, "And she has something very special going for her. She was found by someone who cared enough to help." Detective Rivera cleared his throat gently. "Dr. Chen, you mentioned tests. Do you have any preliminary results that might help us understand why the baby was abandoned?" Sarah's hand instinctively went to her coat pocket, where her phone held the preliminary genetic results. "We're still awaiting final confirmation," she said carefully, "but there are indicators of a serious genetic condition." She turned back to the officers. The baby had a medical ID bracelet on her ankle, most likely from previous hospital visits. The name on it reads, Catherine Walsh. Detective Rivera nodded, making notes. We'll start running the name through our databases. Any identifying marks or notable features we should include in the report. Sarah described the small birthmark behind Catherine's left ear, the slight webbing between her second and third toes, details that might help confirm her identity. As she spoke, she noticed Sophie's mother, whose ID badge identified her as Helen Bennett, RN, watching her with a knowing expression. Of course, Helen would have been working here during Emma's illness. She would know. I'd like to stay, Sophie announced suddenly. To visit her, if that's allowed. She looked between her mother and Dr. Chen, her expression hopeful but uncertain. Sarah noticed Helen giving her daughter a thoughtful look. Sophie, honey, this isn't like the animal shelter. There are protocols. Actually, Sarah found herself saying, surprising even herself, having a familiar presence can be beneficial for infants in the PICU. As long as it's cleared with the nursing staff and doesn't interfere with treatment, supervised visits might be possible. She didn't add that she'd found herself inexplicably drawn to this case, to this strange echo of her own loss. The meeting continued, with details being shared and statements taken. Throughout it all, Sarah watched Sophie, impressed by the girl's mature handling of the situation. There was something special about this 11-year-old who had acted so decisively to save a life. She reminded Sarah of Emma in some ways, not physically, but in that quiet determination, that innate compassion that seemed to radiate from within. Later that evening, after the police and the Bennetts had left, and social services had come and gone, Sarah stood by Catherine Walsh's incubator in the PICU. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, assisted by gentle pressure from the CPAP machine. Her skin had regained some color, but Sarah knew the respite might be temporary. She found herself cataloging the similarities and differences between Catherine and Emma. The same delicate fingers, but different shaped ears. Similar dark lashes, but a different curve to the mouth. I know what you're facing, little one, she whispered, adjusting the baby's blanket. I've walked this road before. Sarah's phone buzzed, a text from the lab confirming what she already knew. The genetic tests were positive for Lee syndrome. She closed her eyes, memories washing over her. Emma's diagnosis, the frantic search for treatments, the slow decline, the final peaceful breath in her arms. The countless nights spent researching experimental treatments, the second and third opinions, the hope that dwindled with each passing day. Opening her eyes, Sarah looked down at Catherine. But maybe this time things can be different. Maybe this time I can help. In the year since Emma's death, there had been new research, new treatment protocols. She'd kept up with every development, even though she no longer had a personal stake in the advances. Until now, she turned to leave, but paused at the door. Through the PICU window, she could see Helen Bennett at the nurse's station, presumably starting her night shift. Their eyes met briefly, and Helen gave her a small nod of understanding. Beyond her, through the unit's large windows, the storm continued to rage. Sarah thought about Sophie, about Catherine, about Emma, about mothers and daughters, and the invisible threads that seemed to be drawing them all together. As if sensing her thoughts, Catherine stirred in her incubator, one tiny hand reaching out into empty air. Sarah walked back and gently slipped her finger into the baby's grasp. You're not alone, she whispered. None of us are anymore. The monitors beeped steadily, a rhythmic reminder of both the fragility and persistence of life. Somewhere in the city, Sarah knew, Catherine's mother was out there, perhaps wrestling with impossible decisions, carrying burdens Sarah understood all too well. The police would find her eventually. They always did in cases like this. But what would happen then? Sarah squeezed her eyes shut against sudden tears. When she opened them again, her decision was made. Whatever happened next, she would be there not just as a doctor, but as someone who understood the crushing weight of watching a child battle this merciless disease. She owed that much to Emma's memory, to Catherine's future, and to the brave girl who had refused to walk past a bush without investigating a cry for help. The storm outside began to ease, but Sarah knew their own storm was just beginning. She pulled out her phone and began composing an email to Dr. Marcus at Johns Hopkins. He'd been working on a new treatment protocol for Lee syndrome. It was time to call in every favor, explore every option. This time, she would fight not just with a mother's desperation, but with the weight of experience and the power of hope that sometimes came from the most unexpected places. From down the hall, she heard Sophie's voice. Apparently, she convinced her mother to let her stop by before heading home. Sarah smiled slightly, reminded that sometimes the biggest changes came from the smallest acts of kindness. She tucked her phone away and prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that this time, at least, none of them would have to face them alone. 5 days after Catherine's discovery in the park, Jessica Walsh stood in the shadows of St. Mary's Hospital's chapel, her fingers tracing the worn wooden pews. The evening news had shown her baby's picture, along with a plea for the mother to come forward. She hadn't slept since seeing it, her mind tormented by images of her daughter alone in a hospital bed, surrounded by strangers. The chapel's stained glass windows cast muted rainbow patterns across the floor, a stark contrast to the turmoil in Jessica's heart. At 26, she had never imagined herself here, a single mother, drowning in medical bills, who had committed the unthinkable act of abandoning her child. The weight of her guilt pressed down on her chest like a physical thing. "I thought I might find you here." Jessica spun around to find Dr. Sarah Chen standing in the doorway. Her heart nearly stopped. "How did you?" "Security cameras caught you watching the PICU from the parking lot last night," Sarah said quietly, letting the chapel door close behind her. "You have your mother's eyes." I recognized them from Catherine's face. Jessica's legs gave way, and she sank into the nearest pew. "Are you going to call the police?" Sarah moved further into the chapel but maintained a respectful distance. "That depends on our conversation." She paused, then added, "I know about the Lee syndrome diagnosis from Boston Children's Hospital." "Then you know why I did it," Jessica whispered, tears beginning to fall. "The experimental treatments they suggested. Even with insurance, I can't." She broke off, shoulders shaking. Sarah sat down in the pew across the aisle. "I know exactly what you're going through, Jessica. My daughter Emma had Lee syndrome too. She passed away last year." The confession hung in the air between them. Jessica looked up, really seeing the doctor for the first time. The shadows under her eyes, the grief etched in fine lines around her mouth, the understanding in her gaze. "Did she suffer?" Jessica asked, her voice barely audible. "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I made sure of that. But I also made sure we tried everything possible first." She took a deep breath. "There are new treatments being developed, Jessica. Things that weren't available when Emma was sick." Dr. Marcus at Johns Hopkins. "Stop," Jessica interrupted, standing abruptly. "Please just stop. I know about the new treatments. I spent months researching, hoping, praying. But do you know what they cost? Do you know what it's like to choose between paying for treatments that might not even work and keeping a roof over your child's head?" Sarah stood as well, her voice taking on an edge of urgency. "There are programs, grants. I've applied to them all." Jessica's voice echoed off the chapel walls. "I've begged, borrowed, sold everything of value I own. I worked 3 jobs until I couldn't stay awake long enough to care for my own baby. And still, it wasn't enough. It will never be enough." At that moment, the chapel door opened again. Sophie Bennett stepped in, then froze at the sight of the 2 women. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I come here sometimes, to pray for Catherine." Jessica stared at the girl, recognition dawning. "You're the one who found her." Sophie nodded, clutching a small stuffed rabbit, one she'd brought for Catherine but hadn't yet had the courage to leave. "She's getting stronger," she offered tentatively. "I visit her every day after school. She likes when people read to her, and she holds onto your finger really tight, like she never wants to let go." The simple observation broke something in Jessica. She collapsed back onto the pew, sobs racking her body. Sophie moved instinctively toward her, but Sarah held up a hand, stopping her. "Sophie, honey, could you give us a moment?" But Jessica looked up, wiping her eyes. No, please, let her stay. I need to know everything about Catherine. These past 5 days. Not knowing, Sophie approached cautiously, sitting beside Jessica. With the natural compassion that had led her to check that bush in the park, she began to talk about Catherine, how the nurses had discovered she loved classical music, how she seemed to smile in her sleep, how her favorite time of day was sunset when the light turned golden through the picu windows. Sarah watched the interaction, her medical training warring with her personal experience. She knew she should call security, alert the authorities. But she also knew that sometimes healing required breaking away from standard protocols. Jessica, she said finally, I have a proposal for you. But first, I need you to understand something. She moved to sit on Jessica's other side. What you did in the park, leaving Catherine there, that can never happen again. But the desperation that drove you to that point, I understand it. Many people will judge you, but I won't be one of them. Jessica tensed. What's your proposal? There's a new trial starting at Johns Hopkins. I've already spoken with Dr. Marcus about Catherine's case. He's willing to include her, and I found a foundation willing to cover the associated costs. Sarah paused, letting this sink in. But they need her legal guardian's consent. They need you to come back officially, to face what happened and move forward. They'll arrest me, Jessica whispered. Probably, Sarah acknowledged. But I'll testify on your behalf. Explain the circumstances, the impossible choice you faced. And while the legal issues are being resolved, Catherine will be receiving treatment. She'll have a fighting chance. Sophie, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. My mom says sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit when we've made a mistake and try to fix it. Jessica looked at the girl, then at Sarah. Why would you help me like this? After what I did? Because a year ago, I couldn't save my daughter. But maybe together we can save yours. Sarah reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a business card. This is the number for Andrea Morton. She's a lawyer who specializes in cases like yours, and she's willing to take your case pro bono. All you have to do is call. The chapel fell silent except for the distant sound of hospital equipment and footsteps in the corridor outside. Jessica stared at the card in Sarah's hand. Her whole world balanced on this single moment of choice. Suddenly, alarms began blaring from the picu. Sarah's pager went off simultaneously. She glanced at it, her face paling. It's Catherine. She's having a crisis. Jessica stood immediately, maternal instinct overriding everything else. I need to see her. Please. Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. Follow me. Both of you. They rushed from the chapel, through corridors that seemed endless. When they reached the picu, they found a team of medical professionals surrounding Catherine's incubator. Jessica pressed her hands against the observation window, watching in horror as her daughter's tiny body convulsed. Dr. Chen, Nancy called out as Sarah entered the unit. BP's dropping, lactate levels are spiking. Sarah snapped into doctor mode, her voice calm and authoritative as she began issuing orders. But even as she worked, she was aware of Jessica's presence behind the glass, of Sophie standing beside her, offering silent support. Minutes stretched like hours until finally, Catherine's vitals stabilized. Sarah stepped back, allowing the other staff to continue their monitoring. She walked to the observation window, where Jessica stood trembling. She's stable now, Sarah assured her. But this is why we need to act quickly. The trial at Johns Hopkins. I'll call the lawyer, Jessica interrupted, her eyes never leaving her daughter. I'll do whatever it takes. Just, please don't let my baby die. Sarah placed a hand on the window, her palm aligned with Jessica's. We're going to fight this together. All of us. She glanced at Sophie, who nodded firmly. I'll stay with her, Sophie promised. Every day. Until you can be here yourself. Jessica turned to the young girl, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. For everything. For finding her. For caring for her. For being here now. Through the window, they watched as Catherine's eyes fluttered open. Her tiny hand reached out, grasping at air, just as she had done that first day. But this time, her mother was there to see it. Go to the lawyer's office, Sarah said softly. I'll stay with Catherine until you return. And Jessica? She waited until the young mother met her eyes. Emma taught me that sometimes the greatest acts of love require the most courage. What you're doing now, facing this head-on, that's real love. Jessica squared her shoulders, drawing strength from Sarah's words and Sophie's presence. She took one last look at her daughter, then turned toward the elevators. Each step felt like both an ending and a beginning. Behind her, Sarah and Sophie remained at the window, watching Catherine drift back to sleep. The setting sun painted the PICU in shades of gold, just as Sophie had described, casting long shadows that seemed to connect all of them, doctor, child, and baby, in a web of fate and choice and hope. The storm that had brought them together had passed, but its echoes would ripple through their lives forever. In its wake, they had found something unexpected. A chance for redemption, a path to healing, and most importantly, the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, none of them had to face the darkness alone. Sarah's pager beeped again, Dr. Marcus from Johns Hopkins, responding to her earlier message. She looked at Catherine, peaceful now in her incubator, and felt something she hadn't experienced since Emma's death. Hope. Real, tangible hope. Sometimes, she murmured, more to herself than to Sophie. The hardest storms bring us exactly where we need to be. Sophie slipped her small hand into Sarah's. And sometimes, she added wisely, they teach us how to dance in the rain. Together, they watched the sun set on this day of revelations and new beginnings, knowing that while the path ahead would not be easy, they would walk it together, stronger for having found each other in the storm. 3 weeks after the chapel confrontation, Sarah sat in the witness box of courtroom 312 at the Millbrook County Courthouse. Through the tall windows, autumn sunlight streamed in, highlighting the dancing dust motes in the air. She kept her voice steady as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, as Catherine Walsh's treating physician, I can attest that Jessica Walsh's decision to leave her daughter in the park, while deeply misguided, came from a place of profound desperation rather than malicious intent. The financial and emotional burden of caring for a child with Lee syndrome can be overwhelming. I know this not just as a doctor, but as a mother who lost her own daughter to this same condition. Judge Marion Reeves, a woman with silver-streaked hair and keen eyes, leaned forward. Dr. Chen, you've gone to considerable lengths to advocate for Ms. Walsh. You arranged for her legal representation, secured a place in an experimental treatment program, and even established a foundation to assist with medical costs. Why invest yourself so personally in this case? Sarah met the judge's gaze unflinchingly. Because I understand that sometimes good people make desperate choices when they feel they have no options left. Ms. Walsh didn't abandon her daughter. She left her in a public place where she knew Catherine would be found quickly. She chose a location near a hospital. These weren't the actions of someone who didn't care. They were the actions of someone who cared so much that she believed giving up her child was the only way to save her. In the gallery, Sophie Bennett sat between her mother and Detective Rivera, who had also testified about the circumstances of the case. Sophie clutched her mother's hand as she watched Jessica Walsh, seated at the defense table in a borrowed navy blue suit, her shoulders rigid with tension. Furthermore, Sarah continued, Ms. Walsh has demonstrated genuine remorse and a fierce determination to make things right. She voluntarily surrendered herself to authorities, has complied with all court requirements, and has not missed a single treatment session or medical consultation regarding Catherine's care. Despite having to be accompanied by officers each time, the judge nodded thoughtfully, making notes before addressing Jessica directly. Ms. Walsh, please stand. Jessica rose slowly, her lawyer's hand supportive at her elbow. Ms. Walsh, this court has carefully considered the unique circumstances of your case. While child abandonment is a serious offense, we must also consider intent and context. Dr. Chen's testimony, along with the statements from Detective Rivera and the clinical social workers, paint a picture of a mother driven to desperate measures by an impossible situation. The judge paused, removing her reading glasses. However, actions must have consequences, even when they come from a place of desperation. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 2 years of probation, mandatory parenting and financial management classes, and 200 hours of community service, which may be served by assisting Dr. Chen's newly established foundation for families affected by rare genetic disorders. Relief flooded Jessica's face as the judge continued. Additionally, you will maintain regular meetings with a court-appointed social worker and continue participating in the counseling program you've already begun. Custody of Catherine will be restored to you, with monthly monitoring by social services for the duration of your probation. Judge Reeves's expression softened slightly. Ms. Walsh, you have been given a second chance. I trust you will make the most of it. Thank you, Your Honor, Jessica whispered, tears streaming down her face. I will. After the proceedings concluded, they gathered in the courthouse corridor. Sarah, Jessica, Sophie and her mother, Detective Rivera, and Andrea Morton, Jessica's lawyer. The morning sunlight through the high windows caught the tears on Jessica's cheeks, making them glitter like diamonds. I don't know how to thank you all, Jessica began, but Sarah shook her head. There's no need, she said firmly. What matters now is moving forward. The Hopkins trial begins next week, and Catherine's showing promising responses to the preliminary treatments. Sophie stepped forward, holding out a small photo album. I made this for you, she told Jessica shyly. It's pictures of Catherine from when you couldn't be there, so you won't miss anything. Jessica knelt down to Sophie's level, accepting the album with trembling hands. As she flipped through the pages, each one documented with Sophie's careful handwriting, noting dates and small milestones. Fresh tears spilled over. You kept her story alive, Jessica whispered. When I was too afraid to face it myself, you made sure she wasn't alone. Detective Rivera cleared his throat. Speaking of moving forward, I've spoken with the hospital administration. They've agreed to let Ms. Walsh resume her job in the billing department, with some additional training in insurance advocacy. The skills could be valuable for the foundation's work. Sarah nodded, remembering their discussions about turning painful experience into purposeful action. The foundation, hastily established in those tense days after the chapel confrontation, was already helping 3 other families navigate the complicated landscape of rare disease treatment. Helen Bennett spoke up. And you'll have support. We've established a network of volunteer nurses to help with Catherine's care when you're working or taking classes. No one should have to face this alone. Jessica stood, clutching Sophie's photo album to her chest. I still don't understand why you've all done so much for us. After what I did. Because that's what community means, Sophie said simply, with the straightforward wisdom of children. Helping each other through the hard parts. Sarah watched the interaction, feeling the familiar ache in her chest that appeared whenever she thought of Emma. But now it was accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose, of healing through helping others. She thought of the empty room in her house that she was converting into a foundation office, of the support group meetings she would begin hosting next month, of the research papers on her desk detailing promising new treatments. Catherine's afternoon treatment session is in an hour, Sarah reminded them gently. Why don't we head back to the hospital? Sophie, I believe you mentioned something about finishing Charlotte's Web today. They moved as a group toward the courthouse exits, their footsteps echoing in the marble corridor. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings. Jessica paused at the top of the courthouse steps, lifting her face to the sun. It's strange, she said quietly to Sarah. A month ago, I felt so alone that I made the worst decision of my life. Now I have more support than I ever imagined possible. Sarah squeezed her shoulder. Emma taught me that sometimes the greatest gifts come from our deepest wounds. What matters is what we choose to do with them. As they descended the steps together, Sarah reflected on the chain of events that had brought them all together. A child's compassion, a mother's desperation, a doctor's grief, and the healing power of understanding. Sometimes, she thought, the hardest storms really did bring us exactly where we needed to be. Later, in Catherine's hospital room, as Sophie's clear voice read about Charlotte's Web and friendship's transformative power, Sarah watched Jessica hold her daughter's hand and knew that while the road ahead would not be easy, none of them would walk it alone again. And sometimes that made all the difference. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, Sophie Bennett stood once again in Riverside Park. The rhododendron bush where she had found Catherine was now adorned with a small bronze plaque. Hope begins with a single act of kindness. The Catherine Walsh Foundation supporting families affected by rare genetic disorders. The morning sun caught the polished surface of the plaque, making it gleam against the dark green leaves. Sophie traced the letters with her finger, remembering that stormy September day that had changed so many lives. "I thought I'd find you here." Sophie turned to see Dr. Chen approaching, carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate from the cafe across the street. She handed one to Sophie with a smile. "Mom said you'd taken a detour on your way to the hospital," Sarah continued, settling beside Sophie on the wooden bench that had been installed alongside the plaque. "Big day today." Sophie nodded, warming her hands around the cup. "Do you think Catherine will understand what's happening?" "She might be too young to understand the specifics, but she'll feel the love in that room. That's what matters." Sarah paused, watching a pair of sparrows hop along the pathway. "The latest test results came back yesterday, by the way. The new treatment protocol is showing promising results." Sophie's face lit up. "Really? Her lactate levels are stabilizing, and the most recent MRI showed no progression of the lesions. Dr. Marcus is cautiously optimistic." Sarah took a sip of her own hot chocolate. "Of course, we still have a long road ahead. But she has a chance now," Sophie finished. "And she's not alone." The words hung in the morning air, carrying the weight of all that had happened since that September afternoon. The foundation, initially created to help with Catherine's medical expenses, had grown to support dozens of families across the state. The support group that met in the hospital's community room every Thursday was consistently full, with parents sharing resources, advice, and hope. Sarah checked her watch. "We should head over. Jessica will be waiting." They walked together through the park, now bursting with spring blooms. As they approached St. Mary's Hospital, they could see balloons tied to the entrance of the pediatric wing, pale yellow and mint green, dancing in the breeze. Inside, the hospital's small chapel had been transformed. Flowers filled every available surface, and soft classical music played from hidden speakers. Jessica stood at the front, Catherine in her arms, both dressed in matching white dresses. The baby, now 10 months old, was alert and curious, her dark eyes taking in the gathered crowd. Helen Bennett was there, along with Detective Rivera and his family. Nancy Ramirez stood with a group of PICU nurses, all of them beaming. Dr. Marcus had flown in from Johns Hopkins for the occasion. Even Judge Reeves sat in one of the back pews, her usual stern expression softened by the atmosphere of joy. As Sophie and Sarah slipped into their places, Jessica stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, her voice steady and clear. "6 months ago, I stood in this chapel believing I had lost everything. Today, we're here to celebrate not just Catherine's baptism, but the miracle of community and second chances." She looked down at her daughter, who reached up to pat her cheek. "This journey has taught me that sometimes our darkest moments can lead us to our greatest light. Each of you here today has been part of that light." Jessica turned to Sophie. "Sophie, would you and Dr. Chen please come forward?" They approached the front of the chapel as Jessica continued. "Today, I'm asking you both to be Catherine's godmothers. Not just because you saved her life, but because you showed me what it means to never give up hope." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she looked at Catherine, so full of life and possibility. She thought of Emma, as she did every day, but now the memory brought more comfort than pain. Somehow, helping Catherine and Jessica had begun to heal wounds she'd thought would never close. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the priest asked who would help guide Catherine through life, the entire chapel responded, "We will." It wasn't just a ritual response, it was a promise from a community that had come together in extraordinary circumstances and refused to let go. Afterward, as sunshine streamed through the stained glass windows and well-wishers mingled over cake and coffee, Sophie found herself back at the observation window where she'd spent so many hours watching over Catherine. Sarah joined her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" Sophie smiled. "I was just thinking about that day in the park. I almost walked past that bush, you know? It was starting to rain, and I was supposed to head straight home, But you didn't walk past, Sarah said softly. You stopped. You listened. You cared. That's what you did too, Sophie pointed out. With Jessica. You could have just called the police that night in the chapel. But you listened instead. Sarah watched as Jessica moved through the crowd, Catherine secure in her arms, both of them surrounded by love and support. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. A girl who stops to check a bush. A doctor who chooses understanding over judgment. A mother who finds the courage to come back and try again. Sophie leaned against Sarah's side. Do you think Emma would be proud of everything you've done with the foundation? Sarah felt her breath catch at the question, but her answer came from a place of deep certainty. I think Emma taught me how to love beyond limits. Everything since then has been about sharing that lesson. Across the room, Catherine let out a peal of laughter as someone played peekaboo with her. The sound echoed off the chapel walls, pure and joyful and full of promise. Dr. Chen? Sophie asked after a moment. Do you think we could add something to that plaque in the park? What did you have in mind? Maybe underneath it could say, "Every storm has its rainbow." Sarah smiled, remembering rain-streaked windows and desperate prayers, sleepless nights and small victories, and the countless ways love could transform grief into purpose. I think that's perfect, Sophie. Absolutely perfect. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah and Sophie remained by the window, watching spring clouds drift across the sky. Below the hospital, the garden where Sarah had spent so many difficult nights during Emma's illness was bursting with new growth. Daffodils and crocuses pushing through the soil, reaching for the light. Life, Sarah reflected, was like that sometimes. Even in the hardest ground, hope found a way to bloom. All it needed was someone willing to plant the seeds, to nurture the possibilities, to believe in the promise of tomorrow. Catherine's laugh rang out again, and this time, everyone in the chapel laughed with her, the pure, joyful sound of love multiplied, of storms weathered together, of darkness transformed into light. And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had all built together, Sarah knew that while some storms changed you forever, it was what you built in their aftermath that truly defined you. Sometimes, it took a child's wisdom to show you the way home, a baby's cry to wake you from grief, a desperate mother's courage to remind you of love's boundless capacity to heal. The light through the stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns across the chapel floor, and Sarah thought that Sophie was right. Every storm did have its rainbow. You just had to be brave enough to keep looking up, to keep believing, to keep reaching out your hand to others caught in the rain. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found yourself exactly where you needed to be, surrounded by love, strengthened by purpose, and forever changed by the simple, profound truth that hope begins with a single act of kindness.